The Second World War was raging across continents. By 1942, Adolf Hitler's armies stood at the height of their power. Europe lay crushed beneath the iron boots of the Wehrmacht, and the swastika flew from the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow. Yet, even as victory seemed near, the German leader's ambitions grew ever larger. His eyes turned south, toward the oil-rich lands of the Caucasus, a city whose name alone carried immense weight. Stalingrad. The city sat on the western bank of the Volga River, an industrial hub producing tractors, weapons, and steel. It was not merely a city, it was a symbol bearing the name of the Soviet leader himself, Joseph Stalin. To Hitler, conquering Stalingrad would be more than a military achievement, it would be personal. He wanted to humiliate Stalin and prove to the world that German might was unstoppable. In June 1942, Hitler launched Operation Blue, a massive offensive aimed at seizing the oil fields of the Caucasus and cutting off the Volga. The Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, received the order to capture. Confident and battle-hardened, the Germans marched eastward through the steppe, believing that the city would fall in weeks. The heat was unbearable. The plains stretched endlessly, the dust clogging engines and lungs alike. Columns of tanks and trucks rolled forward under the shimmering summer sun. Local villages burned in their wake. The Luftwaffe roared overhead, bombing railway lines and bridges to isolate Soviet forces. The Red Army retreated steadily, leaving behind scorched earth, destroying crops, railroads, and factories to deny the invaders supplies. By late August, the Germans reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. From a distance, they could see the city's chimneys piercing the smoky sky. The Volga glimmered like a silver blade under the sunlight. Paulus prepared to strike. On August 23, 1942, the attack began. The Luftwaffe unleashed one of the most destructive bombing raids of the war. Thousands of bombs rained down, turning the city into a burning wasteland. Whole districts were flattened. Flames consumed homes, factories, and schools. Civilians fled toward the river, seeking safety that did not exist. The earth trembled under the endless explosions, and the Volga reflected the fires of hell. In a matter of hours, Stalingrad ceased to exist as a living city. It became rubble, dust, and ash. Yet even among the ruins, the Soviets did not surrender. Stalin issued a brutal command: not one step back. The 62nd Army under General Vasily Chukov was ordered to hold the city at all costs. There would be no evacuation, no retreat. As the Germans approached, Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga under constant shell fire. Men, ammunition, and supplies were ferried across in small boats through storms of bullets. Many were hit before they reached the western bank, their bodies sinking silently beneath the waves. When the first German units entered the city in early September, they believed they were fighting the remnants of a defeated force. But what awaited them was a nightmare of close-quarter combat unlike anything seen before. The city's destruction had become its defense. The ruins offered perfect cover for ambushes. Every building was a fortress, every basement a bunker. Soviet soldiers waited behind shattered walls and machine gun nests. Snipers hid among the rubble, killing silently and disappearing like ghosts. For the Germans, trained for open-field blitzkrieg warfare, Stalingrad was chaos. Tanks were useless among the ruins. Streets were clogged with debris. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of death. House by house, room by room, they fought for control. The Soviets called it the City of Death. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. General Chukov's tactics were brutal but effective. He ordered his men to fight as close to the enemy as possible, so the Germans could not call in airstrikes or artillery. "We will grab them by the belt and hold on," he said. The Soviets dug trenches inside rooms, crawled through sewers, and attacked from the shadows. A single factory or apartment block could change hands several times in a single day. Names of buildings became legendary places, like the tractor factory, the grain elevator, and Pavlov's house. In that apartment building, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and his men held their ground for 59 days, repelling wave after wave of German attacks. They fortified windows with sandbags, placed mines in stairwells, and sniped from the roof. The Germans were astonished. They had never faced resistance like this. "Every ruin is a fortress," one soldier wrote in his diary. "Every cellar contains fanatics." As the days stretched into weeks, the battle became a nightmare for both sides. The heat of summer faded, replaced by cold winds and grey skies. Dust turned to mud. The bodies of the dead lay unburied. frozen in grotesque positions. Civilians still trapped in the city suffered terribly. They hid in basements, surviving on scraps and rainwater. Shells fell day and night. Children were born and died underground, unseen by the world. The Germans captured most of the city center by October, including the train station and parts of the riverbank. Yet the Soviets refused to yield. Across the Volga, fresh troops continued to arrive under fire, ferried by barges that often never returned. The Volga itself became a graveyard dot. German morale began to waver. They had taken so much ground, yet the enemy kept coming. Every meter was paid for in blood. The Soviet defenders seemed endless, appearing from tunnels, cellars, and smoke like ghosts that could not be killed. Still, Paulus pressed on. Hitler demanded the city's complete destruction. His pride would not allow retreat. Stalingrad, he said, must be taken, whatever the cost. And so, the slaughter continued. Fighting raged in the factory's vast metal skeletons, echoing with gunfire and screams. In the Red October steel plant, machine guns rattled between rusting beams. In the tractor factory, tanks rolled off assembly lines straight into battle. Workers who once built them now drove them against the enemy. The sky was permanently dark with smoke. The ground shook constantly. Day and night blended into one endless struggle. By late October, the Germans controlled nearly 90% of the city. From the air, Stalingrad looked like the surface of the moon, pitted, scorched, lifeless. But on the riverbank, the Soviets still held a thin strip of land, barely a few hundred meters wide. It was the lifeline of the entire defense. There, Chukov's battered army dug in, refusing to retreat. They lived in dugouts carved into the frozen ground, surrounded by death and exhaustion. Each day, they were shelled. Each night, they counterattacked. Supplies were almost gone. Ammunition was rationed to a handful of bullets per soldier. Yet the Soviets held their lines. "The Volga is behind us," one soldier wrote. "There is nowhere else to go." Autumn turned to winter. The first snow fell upon the ruins, covering corpses and craters alike. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. The Germans, still wearing their summer uniforms, began to suffer frostbite and illness. Still, Hitler ordered Paulus to continue the attack. He refused to let his generals withdraw or regroup. He believed the Soviets were on the brink of collapse. But what Hitler did not know was that far beyond the city, the Red Army was preparing a counterstrike. Soviet forces were massing north and south of Stalingrad, building an army that would soon encircle the entire German Sixth Army. For now, though the men on both sides endured the unimaginable, the roar of artillery, the crack of rifles, the cries of the wounded, this was their world. The once proud city had become a frozen wasteland. The Volga, half frozen and red with blood, reflected the burning sky. And in the distance, across the snow, something massive was beginning to move. The tide of war was about to turn. By November 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad had raged for more than 3 brutal months. The city was little more than a carcass of rubble and ash. The Volga River froze in places, choked with the wreckage of sunken barges and the corpses of men who had tried to cross it. Both armies were exhausted beyond imagination, yet neither side was willing to break. Inside the ruins, General Paulus's Sixth Army clung to its positions. His men were starving, freezing, and worn down by endless combat. They believed that one final push might end the battle that soon. They would crush the last Soviet resistance and claim Stalingrad for the Reich. But far from the city, deep behind Soviet lines, a massive operation was taking shape. The Soviet high commander known as the Stav Corps preparing to strike back. Led by Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilev, the Red Army planned an audacious counteroffensive that would encircle and destroy the German forces at Stalingrad. It was called Operation Uranus. The plan was simple in design, yet immense in scale. The Soviets would not attack the city itself, but instead strike the German flanks to the north and south where weaker Axis allies held the lines. These troops, Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians, were poorly equipped and stretched thin. They lacked tanks, anti-tank weapons, and the morale to withstand a massive assault. In the freezing dawn of November 19, 1942, the silence of the steppe was shattered by thunder. Thousands of Soviet guns opened fire in unison, lighting up the grey sky. The bombardment lasted for hours, pounding Romanian positions into oblivion. The ground trembled as shells rained down, exploding in sheets of flame and snow. When the guns finally fell silent, waves of Soviet infantry advanced behind rolling curtains of smoke. T-34 tanks roared forward, their engines howling through the storm. The Romanian defenders broke almost instantly. Entire divisions collapsed under the weight of the assault. Within hours, the northern flank of the German 6th Army was in chaos. Paulus, unaware of the scale of the attack, believed it was just a localized offensive. He ordered his troops to hold their ground inside Stalingrad, but the storm was far from over. The next day, November 20th, the Soviets struck again, this time from the south. The Second Romanian Army was smashed apart by the Red Army's Stalingrad and southwestern fronts. Columns of Soviet armor drove deep behind enemy lines, cutting through snow and ice with terrifying speed. By November 22nd, the two Soviet spearheads met near the town of Kalok, west of It was a moment of world-shaking consequence. The trap had closed. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers, Germans, Romanians, and others were now surrounded. The encirclement stretched over 100 kilometers. The mighty 6th Army, once the pride of Hitler's Eastern campaign, was trapped in a frozen hell with no way out. At first, Paulus refused to believe it. He radioed Berlin for instructions, expecting immediate permission to break out westward while escape was still possible. But Hitler's response came swiftly and decisively. The 6th Army will stand fast. It will not retreat a single step. The German leader insisted that the trapped forces could be supplied from the air. He promised that the Luftwaffe would deliver everything they needed: food, ammunition, and fuel. It was a fantasy. The 6th Army required at least 700 tons of supplies per day to survive. The Luftwaffe could barely deliver 100. Many planes were destroyed by Soviet fighters or bad weather before reaching their targets. The few that made it through dropped their cargo blindly into the snow, often straight into Soviet hands. As the reality set in, despair spread through the German ranks. Food rations were cut to almost nothing. Bread was mixed with sawdust. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Soldiers boiled leather belts for soup. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Frostbite claimed fingers, ears, and lives. The once proud soldiers of the Wehrmacht now looked like specters' faces, hollow, eyes sunken, their uniforms tattered and stiff with ice. The Soviets, on the other hand, grew stronger. For the first time in the war, they held the initiative. Supply lines across the steppe carried ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements to the encirclement ring. Soviet soldiers dug trenches, fortified positions, and tightened their grip around the German pocket. General Zhukov watched from his command post as Soviet units advanced steadily, cutting off every road, every railway, every hope of escape. "Let them freeze," he said coldly. "Let them starve." Inside the city, Paulus realized the magnitude of his disaster. But orders from Hitler were absolute: no retreat, no surrender. The 6th Army was to hold Stalingrad as a fortress, a festing. It would resist until the last bullet. By early December, the situation inside the pocket had become catastrophic. The wounded lay in unheated basements, wrapped in rags, moaning softly in the dark. Hospitals overflowed with the dying. Ammunition ran so low that some units fought with captured Soviet weapons. Yet still, the propaganda from Berlin painted a different picture. Radio broadcasts spoke of heroism and steadfastness. Goebbels called Stalingrad a symbol of German endurance. But endurance could not stop hunger. It could not stop the cold. Meanwhile, outside the pocket, the Germans launched a desperate attempt to rescue the trapped army. The operation was called Winter Stormman Effort, led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most skilled commanders. His tanks pushed from the south, racing towards Stalingrad through blizzards and Soviet defenses. For a brief moment, hope flickered among Paulus's men. They could hear the distant rumble of artillery, the faint echo of vengeance. "Manstein is coming," they whispered. But the Red Army had anticipated it. Soviet reinforcements poured in to block the advance. In bitter fighting near the Mishkova River, Manstein's offensive stalled. His forces were too few, too far, and too late. The 6th Army's fate was sealed. Snow buried the trenches. The Volga froze solid. The trapped soldiers now faced not an enemy of flesh and blood, but the merciless hand of winter itself. One German officer wrote in his diary, "The world has forgotten us. We are alone in an ocean of snow and silence." By Christmas 1942, rations were gone. Starvation had become normal. Men ate anything they could: find rats, dogs, even glue from wallpaper. Some froze to death in their sleep. Others simply lay down in the snow and never rose again. Still, Paulus obeyed his orders. He radioed Berlin. "The troops are fighting bravely, but the situation is critical." Hitler replied, "Capitulation is impossible. The Sixth Army will fight to the last man." The men listened in silence as the message was read aloud. They knew what it meant. There would be no rescue, no way out. The Soviets, now in full control of the skies and the surrounding steppe, began the slow, methodical destruction of the pocket. Artillery rained down day and night. The trapped Germans could do nothing but endure. As the year turned to 1943, Stalingrad was no longer a battle, it was a slow death. Inside his headquarters, Paulus sat at a table covered in maps he could no longer change. His divisions had been reduced to fragments, his officers killed or wounded. Outside, the howling wind carried the cries of men who once believed they could conquer the world. And still, the orders from Berlin did not change. Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German army. The message was clear. No German Field Marshal had ever been taken alive, but the end was near. The winter of 1942 descended upon Stalingrad like a curse written by the gods of war themselves. The city, already a skeleton of shattered stone and twisted steel, was now buried under a suffocating blanket of snow. The Volga River froze, it surfaced like broken glass, reflecting the grey sky above. The wind carried not just cold, but despair. Soldiers on both sides no longer feared bullets. They feared the silence that came when the wind stopped, and only the sound of frost cracking on corpses remained. Inside what was left of the city, the German Sixth Army was trapped. What began as a glorious conquest had turned into a death sentence. Their uniforms were thin, their boots torn, fingers blackened from frostbite. Hunger clawed at their stomachs like an animal they could never kill. They boiled leather belts for soup. They chewed candle wax. They tore pages from Bibles not to read, but to burn for heat. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers dug deeper into the ruins, transforming every basement, every sewer, into a fortress. The Red Army, supplied across the frozen Volga, was no longer retreating. They had become wolves, cold, relentless, and hungry for revenge. General Vasily Chukov, the commander defending the city, told his men there was only one direction left to go: forward, not one step back. He reminded them, echoing Stalin's order. In those words, survival and death were one and the same. The once proud German officers wrote home letters that would never be read. "We are surrounded," one wrote. "The Russians come at night like shadows. The wounded freeze before dawn. We no longer bury the dead, they become part of the snow." By December, the Sixth Army's hope rested on one-man Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. He launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate attempt to break through the Soviet Panzer divisions rolled east across the steppe, engines groaning in the cold. For a moment, it seemed salvation was near. But the Red Army, anticipating every move, slammed the door shut. The relief force never reached. The Sixth Army was alone. Inside the city, time dissolved. Men forgot the date. The sun barely rose. German medics performed amputations with saws heated over candles. Soviet snipers hunted through the fog, each shot a whisper of death. Buildings once meant for families now held only echoes of screams. Even rats, once plentiful, had disappeared, eaten by starving soldiers long ago. In one bombed-out factory, a young German soldier named Karl held his rifle like a cross. He hadn't slept in days. Around him, his comrades muttered prayers or sat staring at nothing. Snow fell through the holes in the roof, dusting the dead as if nature itself was trying to bury them. He thought of home, of his mother's kitchen, the smell of bread, but that memory was fading. Only the sound of artillery reminded him that he was still alive. Across the lines, a Soviet sniper named Ludmila watched through her scope. She had killed 87 men so far. Her breath fogged the glass as she whispered, "For my brother," before pulling the trigger again. The recoil was soft, like punctuation to a promise. The Soviets began broadcasting propaganda through loudspeakers. "German soldiers," the voice said in perfect German, "the winter will kill you before we do. Lay down your weapons." Some laughed, some cursed, some quietly did just that, hands trembling as they surrendered to the snow. By January, starvation had become the real enemy. The Sixth Army's daily rations dropped to 50 grams of bread, half frozen, half sawdust. Horses were eaten. The wounded begged to be shot. Discipline collapsed. Commanders could no longer inspire, only order. And even orders began to lose meaning in the face of death. Field Marshal Paulus, once a symbol of German precision, sat inside a ruined department store that now served as his headquarters. He looked at his maps, the lines of his army shrinking every day. "We are the victims of our own success," he muttered. His aides stared silently. There was nothing left to command. Outside, Soviet loudspeakers repeated, "Surrender, Germans, you have no way out." And they were right. Planes trying to resupply the trapped soldiers were falling from the sky, either shot down or frozen mid-air. The Luftwaffe could no longer reach them. The men of the 6th Army began writing their final letters. "My beloved," one wrote, "if this letter reaches you, I am no longer among the living. Do not weep. I fought bravely, but the cold is stronger than courage." The letter was never sent. At night, Soviet artillery thundered without end. The explosions painted the snow red and black. Entire buildings collapsed, crushing those inside. The Germans called it Der Kessel, the cauldron, and it truly was one, a boiling pit of ice and death, with no escape. The Soviets advanced room by room, brick by brick. They used flamethrowers to clear bunkers. The smell of burning flesh mixed with gunpowder and smoke. For every meter gained, dozens died. But they kept going. They were not fighting for glory, they were fighting for revenge. For every burned village, every murdered family, every humiliation suffered since 1941. When the new year came, there was no celebration, only snow, blood, and silence. The Germans had begun to understand what Stalingrad meant: not a city, but a graveyard. In mid-January, the Red Army closed the circle completely. There was nowhere left to go. The German front collapsed into chaos. Soldiers screamed for medics who were already dead. The once mighty Wehrmacht had become a ghost trapped in the ruins of its own ambition. On the night of January 22nd, Paulus received a final message from Hitler. "You will stand fast. You will fight to the last bullet. Surrender is forbidden." Paulus, exhausted and hollow-eyed, whispered to himself, "To the last bullet. There are no bullets left." Outside, the wind howled like a requiem for the lost. The German soldiers waited for dawn, knowing it might never come. The Red Army prepared for the final strike, and above it all, the frozen ruins of Stalingrad stood silent monuments, not of victory yet, but of endurance. The city had not fallen, not yet, but it had already been reborn in blood. The morning of January 26, 1943, broke over a city that no longer existed. Stalingrad was now a landscape of ghosts, silent, white, and broken. Smoke still rose from craters that had long since stopped burning. The wind carried a low moan, as if the city itself was breathing through the wounds carved by months of war. The Soviet offensive was closing in from all sides. The once mighty German 6th Army, which had marched with banners and brass bands across the steppes of Russia, was now cornered into a few square kilometers of rubble. What had begun as a campaign of domination had ended in the most brutal siege of modern history. The soldiers, barely human anymore, huddled in basements and holes, clutching their rifles like memories. They were no longer fighting for the Führer. They were fighting for warmth, for food, for one more breath. The Red Army advanced methodically, building by building, room by room. Machine gun bursts echoed through the fog. Grenades rolled down stairwells. Soviet soldiers shouted as they charged through the wreckage. For the defenders, every moment felt like the last. The city that Hitler had promised would fall easily had now become the grave of his greatest army. In one destroyed building, a German captain looked at his men, barely 20 left from a company of 200. Their faces were grey, eyes hollow. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "it's over." No one responded. They all knew it. The cold had taken the will to speak. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. The message from Berlin was clear: no German Field Marshal had ever been captured alive. It was an unspoken order to die. Paulus sat in silence as the message was read aloud. His adjutant waited for his reaction, but none came. He simply looked at the cracked walls around him and said, "I have no intention of shooting myself for that Austrian corporal." By then, the Red Army had already split the pocket in two. The northern group, trapped around the tractor factory, was crushed within days. The southern group, where Paulus himself commanded, held out a little longer, if only because surrender still felt like treason. But treason against what? The Reich was hundreds of miles away. Hitler was safe in a warm bunker. The men freezing in Stalingrad had only each other and the dead. Soviet loudspeakers again called for surrender. "German soldiers," the voice said, "you are surrounded." Every hour you fight is another hour you die for nothing. Inside the ruins, some soldiers began to lower their weapons. Others still fired blindly, too afraid to stop. On the night of January 30th, Paulus received the final Soviet ultimatum. It was short, almost merciful. Surrender now, or be annihilated. He looked at his staff. The last men left of his command. I cannot fight anymore, he said. It would be murder to continue. At dawn, he sent his aide to deliver the message of surrender to the Soviet headquarters. When Soviet troops entered the basement of the Univermag department's command post, they found him sitting calmly at a wooden table. His uniform was immaculate, though his face was gaunt. "Are you Field Marshal Paulus?" one officer asked. Paulus nodded. "Yes, you are now a prisoner of the Red Army." He stood, adjusted his coat, and said simply, "I have no orders anymore." The last shots in the southern pocket fell silent soon after. By February 2nd, 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad was over. The remaining German troops, emaciated, frostbitten, barely alive, emerged from their shelters with white rags tied to sticks. Entire regiments surrendered without a fight. Soviet soldiers looked at them, not with hatred, but disbelief. These were not the invincible invaders who had once terrified Europe. They were shadows in torn uniforms, barely recognizable as men. Out of the 300,000 who had entered Stalingrad, fewer than 90,000 were captured alive. Of those, only about 5,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest perished in Soviet captivity, claimed by disease, exhaustion, and the lingering cold of that cursed winter. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was more than victory. It was resurrection. The myth of Nazi invincibility had died on the banks of the Volga. The people who had once fled in fear were now the hunters. Stalin declared a national day of celebration, but in the city itself, there was nothing left to celebrate. Not a single building stood untouched. Not a single family remained whole. The city was gone, but its name would echo forever. Back in Berlin, the news of the defeat spread like poison. Hitler refused to believe it at first. He raged, screamed, and blamed everyone but himself. They should have fought to the last man, he shouted, but the truth was undeniable. The dream of conquering the East had died in the snow. The loss at Stalingrad shattered the illusion of German superiority. It was the turning point of the entire war. After Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht would never again go on the offensive in the East. From that point onward, they would retreat slowly, painfully, all the way back to Berlin. And yet, amidst the ashes, there was a strange silence. Even the victors did not feel joy. A Soviet general wrote in his diary, "We have won, but I cannot smile. I am standing on the graves of 100,000 men." As the sun set on February 2nd, the ruins of Stalingrad glowed red once more, not from fire, but from the last light of day shining off the snow. The battle was over, but the horror would linger in the minds of all who survived. Among the wreckage, the wind carried whispers of languages from both sides, German, Russian, cries, prayers, all merging into one final sound, the silence of victory. The Red Army raised the flag of the Soviet Union over what remained of the city. It was tattered, burned, and covered in ash, but it stood. Stalingrad had endured the impossible. The world would remember that name forever. The guns fell silent, but the echoes of Stalingrad never stopped. What remained of the city was not a victory parade, it was a cemetery made of bricks and snow. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the air. The frozen bodies of soldiers from both sides lay tangled in the ruins, their faces turned toward a grey sky that had watched everything and forgiven nothing. When the Soviet soldiers walked through what had been the center of the city, they did not cheer. They moved quietly, stepping round the dead as if afraid to wake them. Some searched for comrades who never returned. Others sat on broken walls and stared into the emptiness, unsure whether to feel pride or grief. The victory at Stalingrad had come at a price beyond imagination. Over 2 million men were killed, wounded, or captured in the 6 months of fighting. Civilians, caught between the armies, had starved in basements and burned in their homes. The city once called the pride of the Soviet Union was gone flattened to dust. But from that dust, a legend was born. In Moscow, Stalin addressed the nation. "The Red Army has destroyed the German invaders," he declared. "Stalingrad will live forever in history." Across the Soviet Union, bells rang, choirs sang, and people wept. Mothers who had lost sons smiled through tears, whispering, "We have won." In Berlin, there was silence. The Nazi high command tried to hide the defeat, calling it a temporary setback. but the truth could not be buried. The German people received letters or sometimes just a single official notice, missing in the east. Mothers read those words again and again, as if repetition could change them. It never did. In the weeks that followed, Soviet engineers began clearing the ruins. They found diaries frozen in the rubble pages, filled with words of fear, love, regret. One, written by a young German soldier, ended with, "We no longer fight for victory. We fight to die with meaning." Another, written by a Russian nurse, simply said, "If I do not return, tell my mother that I saw the Volga freeze and I believed we would win." The survivors of Stalingrad carried scars deeper than the wounds on their bodies. Many never spoke of what they saw. One Soviet sergeant recalled years later, "It was like walking through hell, only colder." Another said, "We stopped counting the dead because it no longer mattered." For the German prisoners marched into captivity. The road was endless. They stumbled through snow for hundreds of kilometers, many collapsing before reaching the camps. Those who survived the journey found only hunger and sickness waiting for them. Some lived for years in Siberia before being allowed to return home. When they did, they came back as old men, haunted by the ghosts of a city that had swallowed them whole. The Battle of Stalingrad changed everything. Before it, Germany had seemed unstoppable. After it, the myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered forever. The defeat at Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's empire. From that moment, the Red Army would advance relentlessly westward, through the ashes of cities, through Berlin itself until the swastika was torn down. But Stalingrad was more than a military turning point. It was a similar lesson written in blood. It showed the world the extremes of human endurance, courage, and cruelty. It showed that war is not about glory, it's about survival. And it showed that sometimes victory and tragedy can be the same thing. In the years after the war, the Soviet Union rebuilt brick by brick. The city rose again. Streets were renamed for heroes. Monuments were built where entire divisions had fallen. The Mamayev, Kurgan Hill, where thousands had died, became sacred ground. At its summit, a colossal statue now stands. The motherland calls. Her sword is raised to the sky, her face fierce and mournful. Beneath her feet lie the remains of tens of thousands of soldiers who will never march again. Visitors walk through that place in silence. Some leave flowers, some simply stand, feeling the wind that still whispers across the Volga. It carries the same sound that men heard in 1942, the sound of endurance. Every year, on the anniversary of the battle, veterans gather to remember. Their uniforms have faded, their medals tarnished by time, but their voices still tremble when they speak of that winter. "We did not fight for Stalin," one said quietly. "We fought for each other, for the man beside us, for the Germans who survived." The memories were just as heavy. Many admitted that Stalingrad broke them not just as soldiers, but as human beings. One veteran said, "I left my soul on that riverbank." Another whispered, "We were not men anymore. We were ghosts." The ruins of Stalingrad were eventually rebuilt into a new city of Volgograd. Yet the name Stalingrad never truly disappeared. To the world, it remained a word that meant defiance, suffering, and endurance. To historians, it was the moment when World War II turned its tide. And to those who fought there, it was simply the place where time stopped. Today, if you stand on the banks of the Volga at dawn, you can still see the faint outline of the old city beneath the new one. The river moved slowly, as if carrying the memories of those who died along its shores. The wind feels cold, even in summer, and if you listen long enough, you might almost hear them, the whispers of soldiers, the distant thunder of artillery, the heartbeat of a city that refused to die. Stalingrad is more than history. It is a warning carved into the bones of humanity. It tells us that war, no matter how righteous it may seem, always ends the same way, in loss. It tells us that courage can live even in hopelessness, and that sometimes the greatest victory is simply to endure. The city's scars remain, visible and invisible, but so does its spirit. The same soil that once drank the blood of 2 million men now grows flowers. Children play where tanks once burned, and the Volga still flows quiet, eternal, and indifferent. History remembers dates, battles, and generals, but Stalingrad remembers the human soul, fragile, cruel, and beautiful. It remembers the silence after the last gunfire. It remembers how the snow fell that night when the war finally ended. And somewhere, in that silence, the ghosts of Stalingrad still march, not in hatred, not in victory, but in memory, forever.